The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for joining me this week. I'm glad that we are together again. And this week we're going to dive into something I have not really gotten into with at any professional level in all the years I've been doing this stuff. We're going to talk about sex. We're going to talk about sex after cults, okay? And after coercive experiences or after, some rough times that some of us have had, right? To do this, I'm bringing on a couple experts. This week, we are talking to Jeremiah Gibson and Julia Postema, sorry. Totally mixed that up. Anyway, welcome to my show, Jeremiah and Julia. Thank you very much for being here today. You are both certified sex therapists and licensed relationship counselors. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. I'm talking to educated people, experienced people about this, because I wanted the first foray into this to be one that was fact and evidence based, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Yeah.
And experts both in terms of the work that we do and what we research and the clients that we work with. And Julia and I have also experienced our own leaving of evangelical communities as well. So there's a professional competence and also an experiential kind of personal competence to this as well.
Perfect. Well, in fact, that's perfect because that segues exactly into what I was going to ask you, which is, how did you guys get into this?
Great question. So I grew up in a fundamentalist Baptist community, and the structure of my church, my very tiny Christian school, I only graduated with 3 other people, and my Christian camp, yes, really defined my entire adolescence and early adulthood. In college, I studied social work and I pursued a career and therapy. However, as I was pursuing my career in therapy, I was unlearning some of the messages of my growing up experiences. However, those sex messages tend to be the most deeply entrenched within us. So I got married quite young. I was 22 years old. And I was quite committed to what I learned about purity culture. And when I got married, and not only did sex not meet what I was promised, I had a personal, professional, and existential crisis. I don't say that lightly. It was far more than sex not working well. And ultimately, after becoming a client in sex therapy, that's what I pursued because I wanted to help folks to have the education that I and so many other people never received.
Excellent. Excellent. And Jeremiah, what about you?
Yeah, so 2 elements to my story. One, in my 20s and early 30s, I was actually a worship minister. I worked at a 2,200 person church in West Texas for my early 20s, and then moved into a much smaller church in New England. So I grew up in a denomination called the Church of Christ, which is a very literalist, very cognitive, very thinky type of organization, and really was committed to really found a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging, both in that community and also being a minister, being on a paid staff. So that was going on. I also married young. I was 24 when I got married, and that relationship had a lot of sexual challenges, panic attacks, high levels of anxiety, this really interesting mixture of avoidance and conflict around, specifically around sexuality. And eventually, those two worlds, as I began to study sex therapy as an extension of becoming a relationship therapist in my early 30s, those two worlds, as we'll talk about in a bit, those two worlds collided, and I couldn't do both. And many folks who are leaving evangelical communities and cults are in that position. And there's the dictates of the rules of sexuality of the cult or of the high control religion. And then there's the sexual health principles that Julia and I will talk about. And sometimes you could try, lots of people try to do both, but for many folks at some point, you got to pick one. And in my case, I got kicked out of my church. So the church made it, they fired me, and I chose not to come back. So they kind of made my choice for me. And in the midst of that, lost my marriage not too long after that. But those experiences, and then meeting Julia not too long after that, and hearing your experiences, finding our shared experiences led to the development of our podcast, Sex Evangelicals, the sex education the church didn't want you to have.
Right. And which is how we connected. And I am so glad you guys are doing that, because well, let me ask you this. Has your, are you still religious? Do you still have religious beliefs or ideas? Or have you eschewed all of that as part of the process of leaving the groups behind?
It depends on the
question.
day. And I understand that people want to know. What has been really helpful in leaving a fundamentalist community is that not knowing the answers is actually initially quite uncomfortable and then ultimately quite freeing. So I hold on to something outside of myself that exists. I don't know what that is, and I am so okay with that.
Right.
And there are certainly values from the church that I hold on to as well that I carry into this day that are really important. The value of hospitality, the value of compassion, the values of kindness. Like, I learned all of those in the church, way more than I learned those in public school. And I'm thankful for those. I'm thankful for those values. I continue to practice those values in my personal and professional life. I think for me, it's also really interesting. Part of the healing process for me has also been able to study on a more like sociological level how religions work, how cults work, and understand, at least on a more like intellectual level, the ways that these systems treat people, harm people at times, and also developing relationships with other people who have similar experiences as Julia and I do.
Sure.
It's been really healing.
And when I work with clients who are in the process of what we commonly call deconstruction, sometimes clients might wonder what kind of opinion I have. And if a client asks me directly, I'm happy to share. However, I always tell my clients, I have no stake in where you land.
Yeah.
So if a client decides that it's really important for them to find a religious community that's open and affirming, I have a lot of resources to support them. And if they say, I am never going to walk into a religious or even spiritual space again, and I am going to hold on to perhaps a more atheist identity, then that's fine too. And there's a lot of middle spaces in between. So I talk with clients about what your values are rather than what are the new rules or new dictates that you want to pursue.
Well, that's a very, very that's great. Thank you very much for breaking all that down like that, because there's first off, I want to make sure everybody in the audience understood you're not just people with an axe to grind, or this isn't some venge quest or something against religion or religious ideas. There's a lot of value to be found in the community and the faith and the hope that religion can provide for people. And I don't want people thinking that we're trying to poo-poo any of that when we start about control structures and rules and behaviors that can be, in some religious groups, can be quite damaging to a person's health, especially their sexual health, when there's all these restrictions and arbitrary rules and frankly, outdated ideas that are sort of, put on people, especially kids. Mm-hmm. have a great deal to do with their personality formation when it's kids,
Right.
and therefore how they're going to behave for the rest of their lives and how they're going to treat their kids. So
Yeah.
I think it's important that we be clear about, we're not down on religion as a belief set, but there's things some groups get up to that aren't so great. And you guys end up having to deal with the fallout of a lot of that.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go ahead then and take a good hard look at something that a lot of cult members struggle with, and that is healthy sexual boundaries. And what even does that mean? Because a lot of people will get an idea, especially the more high control the group is, that the rules are very black and white. They are very simple. It is marriage that opens the door to sex, and it's all going to be wonderful after that. And that's all the boundary thinking you need to know about, right? And that's kind of how a lot of kids are raised in religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that works out so well for a lot of people.
No,
Nope.
it doesn't.
Yeah, why would that be? And what do you have to say about that?
Great question. I was reflecting on what I learned growing up and what so many people learn. And exactly as you're describing, the rules set the boundaries. So, one of the primary rules is you enter into a heterosexual monogamous relationship, and you do that while preserving your sexuality in advance. And then that means if you do that well, if you do that as perfectly as possible, God is going to bless your sexual life. That is not true. Folks in high control religious groups, especially of the evangelical, Mormon, and Pentecostal variety, learn quite a bit about gender and how men are inherently more sexual and women are inherently less sexual. And the ideas about gender are this really awful marriage, pun intended, of like misogyny and misandry all at the same time. And those are two of the primary types of rules. And we can talk about other rules later if it's helpful. But all of those rules focus specifically on behaviors, rigid behaviors, and they actually don't say anything else about the values that I also learned in Sunday school, which was to love your neighbor and to be kind. And as Jeremiah referenced, practice hospitality. So rather than focusing on the don't, what Jeremiah and I want to do is focus on like healthy sexuality through the sexual health principles developed by Doug Braun Harvey and Michael Vigorito. And Jeremiah loves to talk about the sexual health principles, so I will let him take the lead on that.
Take it away.
Well, so I like the idea of principles, but also these are values.
Yes.
And Julia, just to summarize what you're saying, the shift that we make with folks is moving away from defining successful sexuality based on the behaviors that the ways that you perform sexuality. So a man marries a woman. Sexuality happens when a penis enters a vagina, like those things. And moving into values or processes, and ultimately relationship processes or dialogues between two or more people. That's really what we're moving folks to consider. And Doug Braun Harvey and Michael Vigorito talk about 6 principles that we hold on to. The first one is consent. Consent meaning that sexuality ultimately is an agreement between two people, that there's a clear understanding that, one, this is what we want. Both people want this. Both people are interested in this to some capacity. And there's some level of clarity about what the rules or what the expectations of the sexual experience are. Even if the expectation of the sexual experience is, hey, let's kind of figure this out as we go along. Like that's still, if both people are on the same page with that, like that's fantastic. Yeah. So consent it communicates that sexual experiences are dialogues, are patterns of interaction between two or more people. The second principle is non-exploitation. So the idea that any sexual experience, at minimum, like this is like low level here, like does not hurt other people. does not hurt other people physically, does not hurt other people emotionally. And if there are activities that do kind of intentionally invite pain, so BDSM is an example of this, that there are clear structures that a couple have, or that group of people have before and or after the experience to check in on the relational, the emotional health. Hey, how you doing following this? I noticed that, I spanked you really hard. How are you feeling with that? Like being willing to have that conversation. The third principle is the avoidance of unwanted pregnancies, and then the utilization of contraception. We do recognize, of course, that sexuality and fertility are related, even though we're trying to move away from the idea that the sole purpose of sexuality is fertility, which is what Western religions have taught for some time. We do acknowledge that exists, and that there are also tools in place to prevent that from happening. So if you don't want a pregnancy as an option, like how are you navigating that?
And STI disclosure along with that protective element.
That's right.
Good point. Right. Good point. Yep.
And the fourth one is honesty, which speaks to the STI development thing. If you have some sort of a preference or some sort of a bodily related thing that might impact the sexual experience, such as an STI, we disclose that. We're honest about that. We're talking about what we want. And ideally, given the fact that sexual experiences are relational experiences, as we're thinking about this, and we could talk about masturbation kind of in another conversation, but as Julia and I work primarily with relationships, we're thinking about this relationally, that the people that are engaged in a sexual experience have a shared value. There's a shared understanding of like what they want out of the sexual experience. Yeah, you know what? I'm good that this is a hookup. This is a one-night stand. We end this after we have sex with each other and we don't see each other again. Like if both people are on board with that, fantastic. But if one person wants that and one person wants something else, then we have some discussion, some negotiating to do. The sixth thing is pleasure, that it feels good, and that it feels good for all people involved. Specifically, that it feels good emotionally, but also physically, and not just in terms of orgasm, but in terms of all physical pleasure. So those are the six values that when Julia and I are talking with folks about sex, when we're listening and asking questions about the sexual experiences that people are having, those are the lenses that we're looking through and helping people figure out how they want to create better patterns that enable them to practice those values,
Those are great. I sort of immediately am thinking when you take number one and what number five, I think you end up with informed consent.
That's right.
Yes, absolutely.
And that makes, just adding that one word in the front of consent makes it really does take it to a whole new level, doesn't it? Because it implies or infers that there must be communication, that there has that are recognizing through informed consent that there is a relational aspect to this. Some people, especially young people, through inexperience and false information and expectations and everything, it's so self-centered as an activity. Right at the beginning is of when we first start learning about and doing it, and to keep front and center that it's actually that it's a relational activity. You wouldn't think you'd need to say stuff like this, but that's the whole point, isn't it? We do have to say like this.
Right. And Chris, I'm glad that you said what you did a minute ago about the individualism and the fact that Julia and I are doing this podcast, building this business that we'll talk about in a bit. Chris, that you're doing your podcast in a culture and in an economic system that values hyper-individualism, that values a self, that values capitalism, and that often forgets, hey, we're connected to each other. And as we're connected to each other, like we have responsibilities to the people in our lives, and that's not necessarily a burden. Like there's a way to turn that into interactions that result in high values of connectedness, of intimacy, sexual and otherwise, and abilities to really have some beautiful experiences.
Exactly. I'll tell you, I mean, just in the Scientology world, which can be compared in lots of ways with the evangelical world when it comes to sexual morality. It's right out of the Leave It to Beaver 1950s sort of mindset, which is where the founder of Scientology, comes out of. And so
Sure.
that's the kind of rule set you see there, and very strict stereotypical roles with assigned by gender and this kind of thing. It's all just kind of old school stuff. So I guess I'm saying all of that just to say I can relate. You know? So those being six, as you stated, sort of principles or guiding ideas, are there actual rules or blanket sort of things that we can all sort of look to as, okay, well, regardless of individual circumstance, these are things that are going to hold you over well if you stick to these as general rules to adopt? Because people coming out of cults are often adrift. They don't know what to. They don't know what's up and down, what's back. It's all so confusing, and everything that was told to them with such authority is suddenly under question. And yet, the emotions and the attitudes and the feeling of I need to comply with these ideas can still linger long after a person has left a cult.
Totally.
They're habituated into this compliance kind of mindset, if you will.
Yeah.
So what new rules or ideas should they be adopting, building on these six principles?
Yeah. I would encourage folks to check out the book Magnificent Sex by Peggy Kleinplatz. I think this is probably one of the best books out there that answers this question. It's a pretty recent book within the last 2 or 3 years. But Kleinplatz interviews folks who have been in relationships longer than 25 years and also sex therapists to talk about what are the relationship dynamics and what are the ways that folks work together that result in magnificent sex. And some of the things that she talks about, she actually doesn't talk about positions. She doesn't talk about specific types of sex, oral sex versus digital penetration versus any of that. But she does talk about ways that folks are open to hearing each other. She talks about so empathy and being a good listener. She talks about the ability to communicate what you want clearly and also being able to communicate what you want bravely with vulnerability. She talks about being able to take risks together. So being adventurous, stepping outside, giving yourself permission to step outside of your comfort zone. She talks about trust and trust both in yourself and also in the relationship, that you can simultaneously communicate what you want and do it in a positive way without backlash, and that you can also surrender yourself, whatever surrendering kind of looks like in a particular situation. There's a lot of other really good nuggets in there. But I would encourage folks, if you have one book to read to really kind of move into what does healthy sexuality look like in real time, I would start with Magnificent Sex by Peggy Kleinplatz.
I would also suggest Dr. Emily Nagoski's new book, Come Together. That's an excellent resource as well. Both of the books that Jeremiah and I mentioned are directed more towards a longer term partnership. That being said, I would argue that however long the relationship lasts, be that a 15-minute sexual encounter or a forever type of relationship, that you can apply those same principles to whatever the duration of the relationship.
Excellent. Thank you for those. And we'll make sure we note those in the show notes so people can spot those authors and book titles. I wanted to ask, I'm gonna ask you a little bit about what you just talked about in terms of trust, because you got me, a little bell just went off, right? Because, of course, specifically for people who have come out of abusive relationships, culty situations where sex is regulated, and it's almost every cult does that in one degree or another. There can be a real problem with someone or a couple even um, with trust issues.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, trust has been violated in just about every way it can be.
Right.
You know, when somebody's coming out of one of these things and they have to rebuild that. Do you have any tips or ideas for how one, like, real rubber meets the road, kind of what should people be doing to address that in themselves in a sexual way, or with sexual partners?
I'm curious about some specific ideas. I imagine you'll have more ideas than I will, but I'll set this expectation that rebuilding trust doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
This is a long process that we're talking about. So if you are listening to this and kind of fit into or have some experiences similar to what Chris described, and if you want to work with me and Julia or any relationship expert, like this is long-term work that we're talking about. This isn't a 4 sessions and we're done kind of deal. So I want to set that expectation that, if you work with Julia and I, we're going to go slow. The process for getting to rediscover your body, getting to rediscover your own touch, let alone the touch of another person, like that takes a lot of time and a lot of repetition and some trial and error. So just wanted to set those expectations before we talk about some specific ways to navigate that. Hope that's okay.
Sure. If we are getting really nitty gritty, I would suggest lots of check-ins, whether that is a sexual partner or even a new kind of friendship. Talk more than you think you need to talk, especially if it is a sexual relationship. Talk before the sexual experience, talk during the sexual experience, talk after the sexual experience, and check in later that day, in 24 hours, in 48 hours. It sounds extensive, and it is extensive, but it is so important for building the trust. And it can be playful and flirtatious. It can be a text. We prefer as much in real time communication as possible, but it can be a text during the day. Hey, I really enjoyed last night. I'm still thinking about how special this was. How are you feeling about it?
Right.
So you can have it in really intentional, more formal kind of ways, but it can be fun. It can be playful. And I also think that it's helpful to talk about the nitty gritty outside of a sexual experience.
Yeah.
So often when people come to sex therapy, especially out of a high control religious group, they want to talk about sex right away, which makes sense. But often I might say something like, well, let's start with, what do you want to eat for dinner? What kinds of clothes do you want to wear? And those sound like really basic questions, but those are actually 2 things that I spend a lot of time talking about: what you want to eat and what you want to wear. Because if you don't know what you want to eat and what you want to wear, you might not know what you want sexually. And so being able to pay attention to wants, needs, and desires outside of a sexual relationship, being able to build trust with yourself and then communicate those non-sexual wants, needs, and desires to a partner is also really important.
Yeah, wonderful. Absolutely. Communication is absolutely at the centerpiece of the whole thing. And I would, from my own experience, and with working with others over the years, I can't highlight that or underline that enough. Say more than you think you do, than you think you need to.
Yeah.
Really put it out there, because it's shocking to me. I'm one of these like over communicators, right? I've always been
Me too.
that. I was a kid. I'm like just Mr. ADHD. So, rah, 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 rah. But a lot of people aren't. And it's amazing to me how much people will put up with in relationships of not communicating with one another, of not expressing their needs, their wants, their desires, their fantasies, their ideas about things. I think this is vital for a healthy relationship dynamics, that partners understand one another as people.
Yeah.
Because from that comes, oh, now I understand why you'd want this, or why this would be important to you, or why this thing is good, but this isn't. Like, like really getting that person. I can't encourage that enough. I just don't know any other way to a healthy relationship than that. So thank you for highlighting that.
Well, and Chris, what you're also setting up reminds us that cults, high control religions so much of their messaging is about don't. So much of their messaging is about don't do this, restrictive kinds of things. And what you're talking about, what Julia and I are interested in talking about, is also who are you, as opposed to who are you not.
Yes.
So many couples come into dynamics talking about what isn't working. Who are you not? Here's what I think is wrong. And part of our work is also giving name to the preferences, the desires. Julia, what you were talking about, the pleasures, what you enjoy to eat, what kinds of clothes you like to wear. Like those are comments about pleasure. Those are comments about what feels good to you, and giving yourself permission to make the autonomous choice to eat a sandwich at your favorite cafe for lunch on Thursdays, which I may or may not do.
Well, the reason, I'll tell you just another reason why it really connects with me as a former cult member is because cults are not just regulating your sex life. They are regulating your diet. They are regulating your clothes, your choice in clothes, what colors you can wear, all kinds of things, what movies you can see. So finding pleasure, finding choice, and exerting choice across your life doesn't sound like it would have a direct effect on your sex life, and yet it kind of does, right? Because it's all part of the same picture. Now, one of the biggest inhibitions, or sort of like stone walls that comes down when it comes to religion, especially Christianity in the United States, is self-pleasure. Masturbation, right? And this forbidden, the devil's, you're ringing the devil's doorknob. I mean, there's just so many hilarious expressions for this.
Killing kittens.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that one.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Joking the monkey, yes.
One of my favorites.
So, is it really a sin? Is there really something psychologically harmful about it? Is there something morally reprehensible about it? Like, what's the real deal with this? And if religion, traditional ideas about this are wrong, why? Why is this such a big problem?
Do you want to start? Do you want me to?
I can start.
Okay.
I would encourage folks to read Dr. Eric Sprankel's new book, specifically on the history of masturbation and what masturbation can look like in real time. I believe Dr. Sprankel is a psychologist.
He is, yeah. I think so. Sure.
I am not a religious scholar, despite going to a Christian university. However, I can speak from my own scope of practice and what we know from sex educators, what we know from sex therapists, what we know from pelvic floor physical therapists is that physically, emotionally, and relationally, masturbation can be really, really helpful. And I think it's important to talk about how masturbation is not just helpful from an individualistic perspective, but can have some positive impact on a relationship as well. Especially for folks with penises, ejaculation is actually really important for colon health. Prostate health, not colon health. Prostate health. And so we can talk about how important it is on multiple different levels of discipline or field of work.
Cool. And what sort of things have you guys run into? I mean, you guys have been doing this for years. What sort of things do people tell you, or do you run across in terms of things that have been, that they're afraid of or that they're inhibited by that create problems for them when it comes to self-pleasure?
Real quick, Julia, would you mind plugging this into just because it got disconnected somehow? I don't want my computer to run out of time.
Before you share, may I make a quick comment around gender?
Yes, please.
So what I notice for folks socialized male is that masturbation holds a hell of a lot of shame because church leaders have can I swear on this podcast?
You can.
Okay. Have given them the real mind fuck of you are this inherently aggressive sexual creature and you can embrace that part of yourself. And also you have to fight that part of yourself because it also might be the worst part of yourself. That's a real mind fuck. So talking with men who are folks socialized male, that's one of the most dominant themes that I encounter. For folks socialized as women, the most dominant theme I experience or I notice is a very different version of shame because women have learned that they are not sexual people. Right. And so the experiences are diverse, but I often find that women might say, I don't even know my own anatomy. I don't know the difference between a vagina and a vulva. I have never touched myself, so I don't even know what the heck would feel good. And so the shame is the common denominator around gender, but that exists almost on the opposite side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Sort of two sides of the shame coin.
Yeah.
And I would add to that, we can't talk about pornography, we can't talk about masturbation without also talking about sexually explicit material like pornography and erotica. And so there's a lot of relational conflict that can happen around pornography. Julia, you mentioned actually one of the big reasons, and that is the pornography, especially the visual pornography industry, can reflect back some of the gender inequities, some of the messages around misogyny that are unfortunately popular in our culture. Pornhub, for instance, does a year in review every year, and just wrote a Substack article about this. And they talk about like the 5 key themes that they learn from. They start each year by talking about the 5 key themes, and every year the 5 key themes are also cultural trends or sociological trends. We seek sexually explicit material that matches either the implicit cultural messages around gender or the explicit cultural messages around gender. So I don't remember what the 5 are this year, but it's on the Substack article. So there can be conflict around that.
What do you mean? Give me some examples of what you're talking about.
You know, what I say is that pornography or erotica is for fantasy and entertainment. However, fantasy and entertainment isn't neutral. So, and I hate that there is quote unquote mainstream porn and then quote unquote feminist porn, because even that conveys whose bodies and whose pleasure we find the most important. And so, many pornographic sites focus on a very specific body type, and that's in terms of what the body might look like. That highlights racial inequities. So often I'll talk with women who are bisexual or queer, and they'll say, but all the queer porn I find caters to how men want to see queer women or bisexual women. What I would argue, though, is that that is a problem of misogyny, or that is a problem of racism, or that is a problem of some other social inequity. That's not a problem inherent to sexually explicit material.
That's right.
So we have to separate sexually explicit material in a very neutral way, and then all the sociological implications that we place on it, which can highlight social inequities or oppression within a culture or a community.
I would add one more thing to that, Julia, that on top of everything that you said, which is absolutely right, pornography is entertainment, but in a society that devalues and defunds sex education, or comprehensive sex education anyway, and funds sexually abstinence-only education, be that through the Title V sex education program, Abstinence Only Until Marriage Act passed by the Clinton administration in '96, or any number of federal policies after that. Pornography also becomes education for people.
Right. I was going to
which again is not important.
Meant to.
That's
Those
right. That's not a porn issue.
Are not educators.
That's correct.
Let them just be actors.
That's right.
And I will say also that if I'm going to use a buzzword, those patriarchal norms, they hurt all of us, though, not just folks socialized as women or not just folks with very specific body types. I can't tell you how many times an individual man will come to quote unquote sex therapy with quote unquote erectile dysfunction. And when we talk about it, the person might tell me, well, it takes me like a few or several minutes to get an erection. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm like, well, so like, where did you learn that you're supposed to get an erection in 10 seconds? Like, I'm just genuinely curious. And often that will come from pornography. And so when pornography becomes education, it can hurt all of us because all people deserve good sex education.
Right.
Right. Thank you for connecting those dots and also differentiating, because you bring up a very, very vitally important point as far as I'm concerned, and one that goes over a lot of people's heads, it seems, which is that abstinence-only education is still a major player in sex ed in the United States.
It sure is.
2025.
Yeah.
And it is shocking to people who have been exposed to actual sex ed. I grew up in California. So
where in California though? Because if you grew up in Orange County, you definitely got the abstinence only education.
No, Los Angeles. Yeah. Pasadena. Okay. So when I grew up, 7th grade, Planned Parenthood speakers were there.
Yeah.
Educating us in 6th grade, 7th grade on condoms and foam and this and that, all the STIs and STDs. And I mean, we got the whole rundown, and I'm so thankful that we did. And my parents were not of the kind of people who were going to, do sexually repressive education for me and my brother. But I have been shocked to learn that, swaths of this population are still awash in this idea that you just have to abstain and everything will be fine. And it's not unpredictable. It's very, very obvious why such geographical areas have massive problems with unwanted children and teen pregnancies, all these issues, because they are just simply not being equipped with adequate education to stop that problem. And it's a problem not because having kids is a problem, but unwanted kids is a huge problem. So
right. And if conservative groups actually cared about decreasing unwanted pregnancies and decreasing STIs, they would fund Planned Parenthood.
Exactly.
And then also the porn actors wouldn't have all those pressure on them to be educators too. They could just do what they're good at, which is fantasy and entertainment.
Exactly. Because I did want to ask you now directly, right? As we've gone over here a bit, it seems that porn is becoming, documentary material for these kids. And it's not, and it's never intended to.
That's not what it's intended to. That's right.
That's not what it's for. And so none of the actors or producers or directors or people who are putting that together are doing so with the expectation that this is what sex life is actually supposed to look like.
Yeah.
This is not the expectation you should have of what your average sexual encounter is going to look like.
That's right.
This is entertainment in the same way that the Avengers is not what war looks like, right? It's a very different thing. It's a fantasy. So kids don't get that. And I think in the last couple generations of the digital generations where they've only had the internet, right, as in their life, it doesn't even occur to them that there are other sources of information that are way more valid and valuable. Now, that's all conjecture and subjective thinking on my part. How does everything I just said connect with your life and your work?
Yes, 100% accurate. I agree with everything that you're saying. So
okay.
And Jeremiah, you'll be able to point to the sociological research because he's the one who digs into the journals and then I just translate it. I believe that folks, particularly in the younger adult demographic, are actually having less sexual experiences.
That's right.
And while pornography can serve a really helpful role, while social media can serve a really helpful role, younger people aren't learning the social skills that are necessary for all kinds of interactions, including sexual interactions. So that is something that I notice with my younger clientele, and I have a bit of a younger clientele than yours.
Yeah. But building on that, also important to know that the way that communication works in virtual platforms is completely different from the way that communication works in IRL interactions.
Sure.
And what you're talking about regarding specifically regarding relational sexual experiences, Gen Z is definitely having less relational sexual experiences than the millennials are. Being able to encourage, so for folks who have kids, who have kids who are Gen X and young, or Gen X, Jesus, Gen Z and younger, being able to encourage them to get them into as many face-to-face interactions as they can. Because that is where the practice for negotiating what you want, brainstorming what you and another person might be able to do together, like that's where that's going to happen.
Sure. And to link it back to high control religious groups, what a therapist told me when I was deconstructing some of my own trauma around religion, she said, well, it sounds like you had a developmental loss.
Yeah.
And so similarly to perhaps the younger generation who aren't learning appropriate social and sexual health skills, folks in high control religious groups don't learn those either.
That's
and
right.
so then they move into adulthood or even like middle adulthood, and they don't know how to initiate a sexual experience. They don't know how to communicate what they want. And maybe that's because they don't have the skills to communicate it, or maybe that's because no adult or educator encouraged them to think about what they wanted, especially in a high control religious group when that is so literally demonized.
Right.
Yeah, it's a big burden being put on these people, isn't it, coming out of these groups?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a huge burden. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our friend. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
I was just saying, it's rough because the layers of nonsense that are piled onto the person are not something you just snap your fingers and it all goes away.
That's
right.
Waking up, that whole like, oh, I woke up. No, you didn't. You had one realization that what you were involved in had negative consequences on you. Now you have a whole road of waking up to do.
That's right.
So many moments coming, right? That you have to undo that, or as we have said, otherwise, stripping all those onion layers. You got to strip like layer after layer after layer of this stuff off. And as one person said, and like peeling an onion, there's a lot of crying.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it is a disservice to kids. Our friend Jennifer Wiesner, who's a sex therapist in Maine, and she works with parents and adolescents around education. She says, you don't want to put your kids in the middle of a lake in a canoe without paddles. But when you don't give them good sexual health education, that's what it looks like. And Jeremiah and I would argue that sexual health education is relational health education and vice versa. And if you're a parent, you want your kids to succeed. You want them to have the best paddles possible.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to, okay, so here I am, willing and able as a former cult member to want to talk to my partner, to want to be open, to want to be intimate. But what do I do? How do I start this process? Yes, we talk about social skills, but let's say I've overcome some of that. I mean, there's a relationship happening, but it's rocky. It's not going so well, or I don't know how to say what I want to say. What advice do you give to people to, kickstart the engine, to get the process going? How do they overcome their inhibitions, their fears, their uncertainties, the weird looks they get from their partner? I don't know if I should say I want this because what if their heads explode? How do they approach this?
Two quick things come to mind. One, it's important to validate the anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah, your anxiety makes a ton of sense because when you start asking questions about sex and sexuality, you begin to move pretty quickly into the process of deconstruction, where much, Chris, what you're talking about, where like one question leads to another question leads to another question. And then before you know it, not only are you asking a question about, say, I don't know, what type of sexual experiences do I want to have other than vaginal intercourse? But now I'm opening myself up to a whole variety of options, which in and of itself is a terrifying thing, to know that I have like an overwhelming amount of options. It's like going to lunch at Cheesecake Factory, right? And you're looking at their menu that has like 200 items. Like, okay, just give me the first fucking thing that I see.
That's right.
But you're also doing that with people who have been told pursuing sex in these different ways is sinful, that there are relational consequences, that there are theological consequences. You might go to hell. Those things. So the first thing that we want to do is validate. Yeah, this is an anxiety provoking process, and it makes sense. Like I said earlier, that sex therapy with folks leaving cults is ultimately part of what we call a two-choice dilemma. You can do one, you can do the other, you can't do both. You can choose the values of the cult. You can choose the values of sexual health principles, but you got to pick one. You can't have both. Even acknowledging that comes with a lot of anxiety, a lot of potential loss and grief. There's a lot of things that people will do to try to have both, to try to keep their feet in both worlds. And it's important to kind of acknowledge that as part of the process. So that'd be the first thing that I would say, is normalizing the anxiety and also kind of laying out like what this process of healing involves for folks. The second thing that I would add would be, to the best of your ability, especially if you have a significant other, include them in the process as soon as you can. This is because, again, sexuality is a series of relational processes. Even masturbation, you have a very different experience with masturbation if I am able to talk about it, hey, this is something I'm interested in doing. And even if your partner and you make an agreement, hey, masturbate whenever you want to, just don't tell me. At least you're talking about it and you've made an agreement about it, as opposed to keeping masturbation a secret and making it this sexual activity that your partner doesn't have access to and that you don't really talk about. That's a way that you begin to distance yourself. That's a way that sexuality can become disembodied in this process. So include your partner as soon as you can. I get the value of individual therapy, especially if you've experienced some sort of sexual trauma. Having a space where you can talk with someone, with an objective professional in a one-on-one setting can be really, really helpful, especially when processing trauma and kind of recalibrating your body, which is a really important thing for folks who are leaving cults and high control religions. But a different kind of healing and a different kind of trust building happens when you have your partner sitting next to you. And when you can have a relational coach such as me or Julia be able to talk about the relationship process as a relationship process, and also that you can challenge some of the fears that you might be placing onto your partner. Yeah. If I say this, my partner's going to react in some sort of way. She's going to react with disgust. She's going to react with avoidance. Maybe she will. Maybe she'll lean in. And often partners do lean in upon disclosure of vulnerable information.
Yeah. And getting nitty gritty, I would create some boundaries around a conversation. Like Jeremiah said, Cheesecake Factory is overwhelming, even though I love it. Yes. So if you're with a partner or partners, choose one thing to discuss. And it could be, how do I like to kiss? It could be how I prefer to initiate or receive initiation of sex. Anything, but think of a small topic and then choose a time, location, and context that works for you and your partners. If Jeremiah and I are having a conversation that might be a little bit more difficult, whether it's about sex or something else, like hiking is the best way for us to have those conversations. For other people, that is sitting at a coffee shop. Maybe you are on your couch as cozy as possible with hot chocolate, but figure out what works so you're set up to have that conversation well. Set a timer on it. If you are not used to talking about sexuality with your partner, but maybe like keep it to half an hour or so. And I would say that primarily the initial goal is just curiosity and getting to know your partner. As you are having conversations about sex for the first time, maybe make those conversations a little bit less goal oriented and more about fostering a new understanding of each other. And then practice some aftercare, which is something that the BDSM community does really well, and do something with your partner or partners that allow you to feel close and connected following a conversation around sexuality. Maybe it's a game, maybe it's a walk, cooking a meal together, watching a TV show that is funny and light, and think in small chunks because this is such a big, loaded, heavy topic for all of us. And that exercise, specific topic, time, place, and context that works, timed conversation, and some aftercare, that is a really basic, like bite-sized way that you can begin.
That's excellent. Thank you for those very, very practical points. And if anybody out there is freaking out, right, in 30 minutes, I can't talk about this make it 5. It's okay.
Yeah, that's
whatever
right.
Trunk is. Don't worry about it, right? There's nothing. Here's the thing about this is it's about you and your partner. There's no, comparison's the thief of joy, right? Like, don't be comparing yourself to everybody else. And that's how you have to be. Now, there's a couple other things I wanted to ask you about that are kind of hard. One of them is that far, far, far more people than is imagined have been abused as children in these groups or activities. And even if you're not part of a high control group or activity, familial abuse, other group abuse, school abuse. I mean, there's a lot of places where children are sexually abused. It sucks. It is one of the most horrible things that I think a human being can do to another little human being. And it makes me, it gets me going real quick, right? I have a lot of animosity about this, but whatever. What I want to help people with is if that's happened to them, there's a whole nother thing here that we have to deal with, right? How is that factored into your practice and work with people? Big question.
I think that's one of the that's one of the heaviest topics.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have one good answer for that. But to link back to the beginning of the conversation when we talked about establishing trust, that's true for any relationship. But if a partner if a person in a partnership has experienced any kind of sexual abuse, especially a childhood sexual abuse, developing that safety is even more paramount.
Right.
And it takes a lot longer.
Yeah.
And perhaps this is obvious or basic. I would say go really, really, really slow.
Yep.
I would say this to everyone, but especially in a context like this, take vaginally penetrative sex off the top of its pinnacle. If you are in an opposite gender relationship, and focus on small touch, focus on short chunks of time when you are ready, and focus on pleasure outside of sexuality. What other ways do you experience pleasure with yourself and with a partner? Because so often folks conflate, especially in religious contexts, pleasure and sexuality. Pleasure is a part of a relationship that can exist in a lot of different contexts. And the reality is that if a person has experienced sexual abuse, most likely the relationship will have some limitations, be those long-term relationships or short-term relationships. And like, I wish that weren't the case. I don't think there's a way to reframe that. And I'm not going to bullshit anyone by putting a silver lining around it. And in a safe, trusting relationship, you can still have hope. You can still have pleasure.
Yeah.
Great.
And to the partner of the person who experienced childhood sexual abuse, also inviting them to go really, really slow, and understanding that there will be some agitations that come up. There will be some experiences of powerlessness, of hopelessness, that's expected, that they find, and relationship coaching can be a really good space to do this, that they find some safe, non-judgmental ways to be able to talk about those experiences without putting pressure on their partner to pick up the tempo.
There we go.
Because the if a person who has experienced childhood sexual abuse, especially, more often than not, when they get overwhelmed, the response is to shut down, to slow down as quick as possible, and recognizing the relationship dynamic that could come with that. So, just to reiterate what Julia said, for both partners, setting the expectation that this is slow work. Decisions are going to happen in longer chunks of time than you would otherwise want them to. And to give yourselves permission, as you were saying, Julia, to be intentional about taking like 5, 10, 15-minute chunks to talk about very specific topics. This is something I was going to say to the prior question. The question, do you want to have sex, is not a helpful question because, well, what do you mean? Sex can mean like 85 different things. And so, Julia, I really appreciated what you said about having conversations about kissing. How do you want to kiss? Where do you want to kiss? What do you want your lips to be doing while you're kissing the other person? Like being as specific as you can about those types of conversations.
Absolutely, because it's not universal. Some people want a French kiss, some don't.
Sure.
Like seriously,
Sure.
So really learning those kinds of things is everything, right? Because you're down and they're not. You have a conversation to have. You got to figure that stuff out. You can't just force yourself. And at the same time, you don't necessarily need to live a life of suppressed desire. There might be workarounds or things you can do, but you're only going to find that out by talking, right?
That's right.
Now, speaking of, this is the last thing I wanted to ask you guys about, and then I guess we'll move toward wrapping up. You guys have been so awesome. Thank you for everything. This is a tricky one, and that is maybe if I just kind of say real fast, boundaries versus secrets.
Oh, that's great.
That's a really good one. Yeah. Can you say more about
what
specific question?
Exactly. Like you want to be open in a relationship, you want to share, you want to talk, you want to, be intimate. Everybody has the right to boundaries. Everybody has the right to their own secrets too. Now, sometimes the lines can get a little gray here, right? Like what if you, okay, you've come out of a cult situation. You don't even remember all the stuff that happened to you. And over time, some things start coming to mind that maybe aren't so wonderful, in fact, are awful. And you feel the need to keep it secret. And you can call this having boundaries. Or maybe this is not a healthy secret you're keeping. Maybe this should be brought out in the open. Or context is everything. There's no big broad rules here, but I'm kind of wondering, what are your thoughts about this kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I do think that the unhelpful answer, but probably the most accurate answer, is it depends. However, we can still break it down. In high control religious groups, the expectation in marriage is that you don't have any secrets. And that pertains to sexuality, that pertains to money, that pertains to literally everything. And so something that many of my clients unlearn is what it means to have their own secrets, and to not disclose everything to their partner.
Mm.
If you can have conversations towards the beginning of your relationship about what is on or off limits, that might be helpful. So maybe you have a conversation about, let's take sexuality off the table. Hey, it's really important for me. I have my own bank account, and I am going to not discuss every single purchase with you, or I'm going to discuss a purchase over this amount of money, but otherwise I'd like to keep this part of my life secret. Or if a couple is in an open style relationship, how much do you disclose? And being able to have some expectations around that, with the caveat that boundaries change over time, and have some sort of regular check-ins in the relationship. And I think the conversation about secrets and boundaries can come into any conversation. So you're reviewing your finances. Hey, what's the expectation around boundaries and secrets? Hey, we're reevaluating our open relationship. What are the expectations around this? That doesn't give a clear answer, but maybe that gives like a helpful guideline to start the conversation.
It gives a process, because ultimately what we're trying to figure out with a couple is what's public and what's private. What's mine, what's yours, and what's ours.
Right.
And different couples are going to have different answers to that question. And so I agree, Julia, about having those conversations early in a relationship if you can. And Julia and I and other relationship coaches would be able to help you more clearly define kind of what those are. The challenge comes when there are differences. When there's differences in terms of, well, I think this should be public, you think this should be private. And, what do you do? How do you manage the anxiety that comes with those differences and be able to talk about the anxiety? So for instance, if I think that something should be public, Julia, you think something should be private, how do I talk with you? First of all, respectfully understanding and supporting your position that you want something to be private. And then also, how do I talk about my own anxiety in a way that doesn't belittle you, that doesn't attack you, that doesn't criticize you, that talks about my anxiety from the perspective of my anxiety. This is kind of like what my fears are. And maybe that conversation will lead to a different kind of renegotiation of what's public, private, mine, yours, ours. Or maybe it doesn't. And every couple has, the other thing is that every couple has unresolvable conflicts. Every couple has things that they won't be able to solve. And they're often around differing expectations of public and private. So if you reach that stage, if you reach an impasse, not panicking that, oh my God, my relationship is doomed. Maybe it is, but likely it isn't. Likely it's just a manifestation of a kind of a regular interaction within a couple dynamics. And then it's like, how do you then live with the differences and not ruminate on the differences? If Julia is doing or engaging in some kind of manifestation of the private thing, like, how do I hold myself together and not be obnoxious?
Right. And then I would ask, if it's something that you're keeping private, what's the role of the secret? So something that comes up in therapy quite a bit is, let's say, like drinking or substance use. And maybe one person in a partnership doesn't want to share about this problem because maybe deep down they know it's a problem, or they're afraid of how their partner is going to respond. Are they going to think really poorly or negatively of me? Are they going to leave me? Right. And so I know that question doesn't necessarily give an answer either, but maybe asking yourself, what's the reason that I am keeping this secret? And how is it helping or hurting the relationship to keep it secret? And maybe it's one, maybe it's the other, maybe it's a little bit of both, regardless of the nature of the thing that you're holding private.
There we go. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And again, I just wanted some broad ideas, and that was perfect. Because I want to help people. You can give them a step by step, and then they get to step 3 and it didn't work, and now they're stuck.
Right.
That's right.
So instead, you go, no, here's the idea behind it. Here's what we're trying to accomplish, right? And there's a million variations, but here's where we're trying to go, right? And so thank you for that. I think you've given today a lot of food for thought, a lot of ways of approaching this stuff, or thinking about relationships post-cult and the sex life post-cult, and overcoming a lot of the strictures and fears and sort of arbitrary nonsense that gets put on people as a result of a cult or coercive experience. So I think we've accomplished our goals for the day. So thank you very much for being part of this.
Great.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
So much.
Yeah. it's possible we may meet again. There's one thing that we have not discussed. We haven't even mentioned the word, and I'm pretty sure there's a whole podcast to go on with this one. Codependency.
Oh yeah, and that's a huge theme within religious structures.
And that's why I mentioned differences.
Yeah.
That so much of relationship therapy, relationship coaching, sex coaching is about managing the differences. Yeah. In fact, that's how eroticism gets developed, is by understanding that two people are different people, and that Julia, in our relationship, Julia, you can kind of go do your thing, I can do my thing. And that one, there's a promise that we'll come back together. Like that's the commitment that we make. And then when we come back together, the excitement, the energy that comes with whatever it was that we were doing, that's the thing that that creates a sense of connection, which helps to rebuild trust, which helps to rebuild excitement, helps to rebuild curiosity. Codependence is rooted in the idea that I should know everything about my partner.
Well, secrets and boundaries.
That's right.
That's right. That's right. Oh, it was a challenge that had to be overcome in my life. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I get it. Me too.
Get it? Yep.
Yeah, it's wild stuff. Well, again, thank you very much. How does my audience find you guys? If they want to look you up, find your work, or connect with you, what do they do?
I'll talk about the social media. Do you want to talk about the business?
Sure.
Great. So we are on social media, Instagram at Sexvangelicals. We also have a podcast. We're starting a new series called Ask a Sex Therapist, where we are asking 10 questions this winter and spring, 10 of the most common questions that we've heard throughout our years of doing the podcast, doing work together. So that will start first week of February. We also have a Substack. That is where our newsletter is. We write 3 articles per week, free material about relationships, sexual health. You can also become a paid subscriber and get some perks from us. That's at sexvangelicals.substack.com. The Substack's called Relationship 101.
And I was a client in sex therapy before I became a sex therapist. So I encourage people to find a sex or relationship therapist if this is material that resonates or feels challenging for you. And so, yes, shameless plug for Jeremiah and our business. And I speak from experience that sex therapy changed my life.
Yes.
So if you are looking for a sex therapist and you didn't like us, that's fine. Go to asect.org, AASECT.org, and you can find a sex therapist licensed by state. So that is an easy way to find all the sex therapists located where you live. Jeremiah and I are both listed under Massachusetts, where we are licensed. And if you do like us and you don't live in Massachusetts, you can still work with us via coaching. And if you are interested in therapy or coaching, you can email us at info@letshealtogether.org.
And for more information about our business, we schedule free 30-minute consultations with folks that are interested in learning more about relationship coaching, be that with us or not. And you can sign up at our website, www.letshealtogether.org.
Beautiful. All right, folks. Well, you can see some of those links displayed on the screen there, and you'll see them all in the show notes and description to this video on YouTube and on my Podbean platform. So that should go to wherever you're consuming this podcast if you're hearing it in the audio version. So that all being said, I want to thank you guys again for being part of this and taking the time today. Folks out there, if you enjoyed this podcast, you think it's informative, educational, and maybe mildly entertaining, then consider supporting the podcast. And links below, again, in the description. See you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks.